The sun shone brightly on the calm waters of the lake, casting a warm glow over the peaceful land that had been passed down through generations. This lake, nestled in the heart of the countryside, was more than just a body of water. It was the lifeblood of the land, the very thing that connected the past, present, and future of the family who had lived here for centuries. The protagonist, a black man in his mid-40s, sat by the water, watching the soft ripples as they spread across the surface. It was his land, his legacy. And he loved it with everything he had. His name was Thomas, a proud man who carried the weight of his family's history on his shoulders. His great-grandparents had worked hard to buy this land, and their sacrifices were something Thomas carried deep in his heart. He had spent countless summers at the lake, learning about the plants, the animals, and the rhythms of nature. For him, the lake wasn't just a place, it was a part of who he was. It was his family's roots, his connection to the past. But things were starting to change. It all began when the Homeowners Association, HOA, in the nearby town announced plans for a new development project. At first, it seemed harmless enough, a few vacation cabins, some new roads, maybe a small resort area to bring in more tourists. But as soon as Thomas saw the map, his heart sank. The cabins were being planned right near the lake, within a few hundred feet of its shoreline. It wasn't just a handful of cabins either. The HOA wanted to build a total of 139 vacation cabins along with roads, parking lots, and other facilities. Thomas couldn't believe his eyes. How could they even think of doing this? The lake was sacred to him. It wasn't just a piece of property, it was the heart of his family's history. His ancestors had fished in those waters, swam in the cool depths, and lived off the land. It was a space where they had celebrated victories, mourned losses, and created memories that still lived in every tree, every rock, and every ripple on the water. The news of the development spread quickly throughout the town. Many people were excited about the new project. The HOA promised that it would bring jobs and increase property values. Local businesses were already planning for an influx of customers. It all seemed like a good idea to most people, but to Thomas, it felt like a violation. They were going to destroy everything his family had worked for, everything his ancestors had fought to protect. Thomas wasn't the only one who thought this way, but he was the one who felt it the deepest. He knew that the construction would disrupt the delicate balance of the ecosystem. The water that flowed into the lake came from a fragile river system, and the introduction of so many cabins would pollute the water, destroy natural habitats, and forever change the land that had been untouched for so long. He couldn't let this happen. At first, Thomas tried to talk to the HOA. He showed them the historical records, the old photographs of his ancestors, and the maps that detailed the land's importance. He explained how his family had preserved this land for generations and how the development would affect not just him but the entire community. But the HOA was unyielding. They had already secured the land rights, and all their plans were in motion. To them, Thomas's concerns were nothing more than an obstacle to overcome. They brushed him off, telling him that the development was going to happen whether he liked it or not. The meetings with the HOA were infuriating. Each time Thomas tried to present his case, he was met with resistance and indifference. The people on the HOA board didn't seem to care about his family's history or the environment. They only saw dollar signs and the potential for profit. They spoke of progress and growth as if those were the only things that mattered. To them, nature was just an obstacle to be moved out of the way. They promised that the cabins would be built with minimal impact on the environment, but Thomas knew better. He had seen how these projects worked before. They always promised the world, but in the end, they only delivered destruction. As the weeks went by, the construction began. Heavy machinery arrived, tearing up the land, flattening the ground, and removing trees. The quiet hum of nature was replaced by the loud rumble of bulldozers and excavators. The once peaceful lake was now a construction site. The noise, the dust, and the relentless movement of machines were a constant reminder to Thomas that his land was being taken from him. His frustration grew as the construction moved forward. He tried again to reach out to the local government, to anyone who would listen. But the town officials were in the pockets of the developers, and the court seemed uninterested in his claims. It seemed like no one cared. He was just one man, standing against a powerful machine that he couldn't stop. The stress of it all weighed heavily on Thomas. Every morning, he would wake up to the sound of construction crews working, the sight of new buildings going up, and the knowledge that his connection to the land was slipping away. He had always been a proud man, but now he felt powerless. He couldn't save the land in the way he had imagined. His calls for help were ignored, his pleas unheard. It was as if the whole world had turned its back on him. He spent his nights lying awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if there was anything he could do to stop it. He had tried everything, reasoning with the HOA, reaching out to local officials, gathering support from the community. But nothing had worked. The dream of preserving his family's land seemed to be slipping further and further away. One night, as he sat by the lake, watching the moonlight dance on the water, Thomas made a decision. He couldn't just sit back and watch everything he loved be destroyed. He needed to do something. But what? What could he possibly do against such overwhelming odds? The answer came to him in the silence of the night. It was simple, yet powerful. The lake, the very thing that had been at the center of his family's life, could be his weapon. The dam that controlled the lake's water was one of the oldest in the area, built by his great-grandfather. If he could control the water, he could control the land. The idea was risky. It would be illegal, dangerous even. But it was the only thing that made sense. If the cabins were built, the land would be lost forever. But if the water could be reclaimed, if the lake could be restored to its natural state, perhaps he could force the developers to leave. Nature, after all, was the only thing that could fight back against the greed of men like the HOA. Thomas spent the next few days planning. He thought about every angle, every possible consequence. He knew that once he took action, there would be no turning back. But he also knew that this was his last chance to save what was left of his family's legacy. As the construction of the cabins continued around him, Thomas found himself in a constant state of turmoil. He was no longer just watching the destruction of his land, he was living it. And as each day passed, the idea of taking drastic action became less like a last resort and more like the only way forward. The lake, the land, his ancestors' dreams, it all depended on what he chose to do next. The days following the beginning of construction felt like a heavy cloud hanging over Thomas's head. Each morning, as he watched the sun rise over the lake, the once serene waters were now disturbed by the sounds of bulldozers and trucks, grinding away the very heart of his land. The sight of the earth being torn up, the towering machines cutting through the trees and shrubs that had been there for centuries, seemed like a slow death to Thomas. It wasn't just the land being affected, it was the entire ecosystem that had thrived for so long. Fish, birds, animals, all were being driven away, their habitats destroyed. The cabins, 139 in total, were not just a few simple structures. They were enormous, sprawling complexes, meant to cater to vacationers who wanted to escape the hustle and bustle of the world. The idea of having such a large-scale development so close to the lake struck Thomas like a blow to his chest. The developers promised that they would take care of the environment, but anyone who had seen such projects unfold knew that the promises were never kept. Roads were built, water lines were laid, and huge concrete foundations began to rise from the ground. All of it was happening at a rapid pace. Every day, as Thomas drove to town, he could see the construction progressing. The people who worked on the site were mostly indifferent to the impact they were having on the land. They were just doing their jobs, earning their paychecks, unaware, or maybe they just didn't care about the legacy they were helping to erase. To Thomas, it felt like a betrayal, not just of him, but of everything that had come before him. It was as if the past had no place in the future the developers were building. The conflict within him grew stronger with each passing day. He could see the workers moving in and out of the site, day after day, like a constant reminder of his own helplessness. He'd tried speaking to the developers, to the HOA, to anyone who would listen, but they all dismissed him. They kept telling him that this development was inevitable, that it would bring prosperity to the area, that it would create jobs and raise property values. Their vision was all about the future: new homes, new people, more money. But they didn't see what they were losing. They didn't understand that the land wasn't just a resource to be exploited, it was a living, breathing part of his family's history. Thomas knew that if the development continued, everything he loved would be gone forever. But he wasn't just fighting for the lake anymore. It had become personal. His great-grandparents had worked so hard to buy and preserve this land, and now it was being taken away, piece by piece, without any consideration for its significance. The feeling of powerlessness was maddening. He had tried every legal channel, contacting the local council, meeting with environmental groups, trying to get a court injunction to stop the construction, but all of it had failed. The developers had money, power, and influence, and they seemed to have every government official in their pocket. It was in the quiet moments, late at night when he sat by the fire, that Thomas began to consider other options. The frustration, the anger, it was all building up inside him. He had always been a peaceful man, someone who believed in resolving issues through dialogue and understanding. But the more he saw the destruction, the more he realized that sometimes words were not enough. There was a bigger force at play here, one that could not be stopped by meetings or petitions. One evening, after another long day of watching construction crews tear into the earth, Thomas walked down to the lake. The water was choppy now, disturbed by the heavy machinery working along the shore. It wasn't as calm as it used to be. The gentle ripples that had once greeted him every morning now seemed more like reminders of the invasion that was taking place. He stood there for a while, looking at the water, his mind racing. Then it hit him: the answer had been in front of him all along. He had always known that the dam controlling the lake's water was old, built by his great-grandfather. It was a simple structure, but it had always been effective. The dam controlled the flow of water, maintaining the lake's water level and preventing floods. But more importantly, it also controlled the surrounding ecosystem. If he could break the dam, he could release the water and flood the construction site. It would be a dramatic move, a dangerous one, but it was the only thing he could think of that might make the developers stop. If they couldn't build on the land because it was flooded, they would be forced to abandon the project. Thomas wasn't sure what the legal consequences would be, but at that moment, it didn't matter. The thought of watching the cabins go up, of seeing the land permanently altered, was unbearable. He couldn't let that happen. If nature could fight back, maybe it would be strong enough to stop the construction. After all, this was his land, his family's legacy, and if he didn't fight for it now, there might never be another chance. He spent the next few days preparing for what would be a risky and dangerous plan. The dam wasn't huge, but it was sturdy. Breaking it would mean releasing thousands of gallons of water into the land, and that water would flow fast. The cabins were still under construction, but there were roads, equipment, and foundations that would be destroyed if the dam was breached. Thomas didn't know how long it would take for the water to recede or if the damage would be enough to stop the project, but he knew that this was his only option. He wasn't just fighting for his family's land anymore. He was fighting for something larger, something deeper, a fight for what was right. As the days passed, he observed the construction from a distance, keeping a low profile. The workers didn't suspect anything, and the developers were too focused on their progress to notice him watching. But Thomas knew the dam well. He had helped his father and grandfather maintain it over the years. The mechanisms, the gates, and the pressure points, he knew exactly where to hit. And so, With the steady hands of someone who had worked with the land his entire life, he prepared to take the only course of action left. That evening, as the sun began to set and the workers were finishing up for the day, Thomas walked down to the dam. His heart was pounding in his chest as he approached the structure. He knew that once he did this, there was no turning back. The consequences could be severe. But what choice did he have? He couldn't stand by and watch his family's legacy be destroyed by people who didn't care about the land, its history, or the people who had lived here for generations. The sky was turning orange as he made his final preparations. The cool breeze off the water gave him a momentary sense of peace. But inside, Thomas felt something different resolve. He was doing this, for his family, for the land, for the memory of those who had fought to preserve it. As he worked, he took one last look at the water. It was his last chance to stop the destruction. He took a deep breath, gripped the tools in his hands, and set to work, knowing that the floodgates were about to open literally and figuratively. As the sun sank below the horizon, Thomas completed the final steps. He stepped back, watching the water rise as the dam slowly began to break. The first crack appeared in the stone, followed by another. The water began to pour out in a steady stream, and for the first time in weeks, Thomas felt like he was doing something to fight back. The land was speaking through the water, telling him that it was time to take action. Time to let nature do what it did best. The first few minutes after the dam began to break were strangely quiet. For a moment, it seemed like nothing was happening, as if the water itself had decided to hold its breath. Then, slowly, the crack in the stone widened, and water began to pour out in a trickle, spreading over the land below. Thomas watched, his heart pounding, as the sound of the water filling the dry ground became louder and louder. It was as if the earth itself was sighing, relieved to finally be free of the pressure it had been holding back for so long. The water spilled over the edges, gradually at first, but with each passing second, the flow increased. The stream of water became a powerful rush, carving its way through the soil, spreading across the land with force. Thomas stepped back, his eyes fixed on the sight in front of him. The lake that had been so calm, so controlled, was now a force of nature, unstoppable and wild. The water was reclaiming its space, returning to the land in a way that felt both terrifying and necessary. As the minutes ticked by, Thomas realized that there was no turning back now. The water had broken free, and it was only a matter of time before it reached the construction site. The thought of the cabins, the machines, and the workers being engulfed by the flood brought him a strange sense of satisfaction. He wasn't sure if it was justice or just relief, but he knew that this was the only way to stop the destruction. If the developers wanted to build their cabins, they would have to face the consequences of disrupting the natural balance of the land. The sound of rushing water filled the air, growing louder with every passing second. The land that had once been dry was now soaked, the soil turning to mud as the water spread further and further. Thomas knew that it wouldn't be long before the flood reached the cabins, and when it did, the damage would be irreparable. He had watched enough construction sites to know that no building could withstand the power of the water. The cabins would be swept away, the machinery ruined, and the roads destroyed. The flood would take everything, and the developers would be forced to abandon their plans. But even as he stood there, watching the water rise, Thomas couldn't help but feel a pang of doubt. Was this the right thing to do? Was he just reacting out of anger and frustration, or was he truly doing something noble, something that would protect the land for future generations? He had always been a man of principles, someone who believed in doing what was right, but now, with the flood waters rising, he wasn't so sure. He thought about his ancestors, about the struggles they had faced to keep the land in the family. They had fought against the odds, against racism, against injustice, and they had kept this land safe, passed down through the generations. Now, it was his turn to fight. He couldn't let it slip away without doing everything he could to protect it. But was flooding the land, destroying the cabins, The right way to do that? What would it mean for him in the end? The floodwaters continued to rise, and Thomas stood there, frozen, watching as the construction site slowly began to disappear beneath the rushing water. The workers had clearly noticed by now. Some were running, trying to gather their tools, while others were scrambling to get to higher ground. It was chaotic, and Thomas could see the panic on their faces as they realized the full extent of what was happening. But it was too late. The water had already taken control. As the minutes passed, the flood grew more intense. The roads, the foundations, the machines all were swallowed up by the water. The land that had been bulldozed and scraped for the cabins was now submerged, the construction site completely engulfed. Thomas couldn't help but feel a sense of grim satisfaction. This was his land, and nature had taken it back. The flood had done what the law, the developers, and the HOA had failed to do. It had stopped the destruction. For the next several hours, Thomas watched from a distance, his heart heavy with the weight of what he had just done. The flood had reached its peak, and the water slowly began to recede, leaving behind a scene of devastation. The cabins were gone, reduced to nothing more than debris floating in the water. The roads were impassable, and the construction equipment was ruined. It was hard to believe that just a few hours ago, this had been a busy worksite, full of workers and heavy machinery. The flood had done its job, but the consequences of Thomas's actions were just beginning to sink in. He had acted impulsively, without thinking of what would come next. The developers would surely try to sue him, and the HOA would undoubtedly press charges. He had no doubt that the local authorities would be furious. What would happen to him now? Would he be arrested? Would he lose everything? As he stood there, staring at the wreckage, Thomas realized that his fight was far from over. The developers wouldn't just give up. They would want compensation for their losses, and they would use every legal tool at their disposal to get it. The HOA would back them up, of course, and there was no telling how much influence they had with the local government. Thomas knew that he had made a powerful statement, but he also knew that the battle had only just begun. For the next few days, Thomas kept a low profile. He stayed away from town, avoiding the eyes of the people who might turn on him. The news of the flood spread quickly, and the opinions were divided. Some people saw Thomas as a hero, someone who had stood up to the developers and protected the land. Others, however, saw him as a criminal, someone who had gone too far in his efforts to protect what was his. The local newspapers covered the story, some portraying Thomas in a sympathetic light, others calling him reckless and destructive. The public's opinion was divided, and Thomas had no idea where he stood in the eyes of his community. But as the days passed, the reality of the situation began to set in. The flood had caused real damage, and the developers would not let it go unnoticed. Legal proceedings would follow, and the pressure would only increase. Thomas knew that he would have to face the consequences of his actions. He couldn't hide from what he had done. But for now, all he could do was wait and see what the next chapter of this fight would bring. As he sat by the water, watching the calm after the storm, Thomas couldn't help but feel a sense of mixed emotions. The land was his again, but at what cost? What had he really accomplished? Was this the right way to save his family's legacy, or had he just set in motion a battle that he might not be able to win? The flood had taken everything, but it had also given Thomas something he hadn't had in a long time, a sense of control. The question now was whether he could keep it. The days after the flood felt like a whirlwind for Thomas. The land, his land, had been forever changed by the water that had surged through it, destroying the construction site and sweeping away the cabins that were meant to take away his heritage. It was a victory in a way, but it didn't feel like one. As he walked along the now quiet shoreline, he could still hear the rush of the water in his mind, even though the flood had already receded. The debris from the construction site was scattered along the banks, and the ground was still soft, soggy, and scarred from the force of the water. It was hard to believe that just a few days ago, there had been bulldozers, trucks, and workers everywhere. Now, there was nothing but the remnants of what had been a dream for the developers and a nightmare for him. He stayed away from town as much as possible, not wanting to face the people who had heard about the flood, the damage, and the destruction. News of the incident had spread quickly, and the public's opinion was divided. Some people saw Thomas as a hero, someone who had fought to protect the land from greedy developers. Others, however, saw him as a criminal who had gone too far. The construction company and the HOA were furious, and they were already talking about taking legal action. It didn't take long for the first lawsuit to be filed, and Thomas knew this was just the beginning. The developers weren't going to just walk away from the millions of dollars they had invested in the project. They had lost time, money, and resources, and they weren't about to let one man's actions destroy everything they had worked for. They were calling for Thomas to pay for the damages, and they were prepared to go after him with everything they had. The HOA wasn't going to let up either. They had backed the project, and now they saw Thomas as a threat to their plans for growth and development. The legal battle was shaping up to be long and costly, and Thomas knew he couldn't fight it alone. Despite the mounting pressure, Thomas couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. The land was his again. The cabins were gone. The earth, the water, and the trees had been freed from the destructive forces that had been imposed on them. It wasn't just about the land, it was about protecting something larger, something that connected him to his family's history. His great-grandparents had fought for this land, and now it was his turn to do the same. He had no choice but to stand up for what was right, even if it meant facing the full force of the law. As the days turned into weeks, the situation became more intense. The lawsuits were stacking up, and the pressure from the developers and the HOA was growing. Thomas received countless letters from lawyers, warning him of the legal consequences of his actions. He was being accused of willfully destroying property, causing millions of dollars in damage, and endangering public safety. The charges were serious, and they carried the potential for significant fines or even jail time. But Thomas wasn't backing down. He had made a choice, and he was ready to face the consequences. The local community was divided. Some people came to his defense, applauding his bravery and determination to protect the land. They recognized that the fight wasn't just about one man's property, it was about standing up to the larger forces that prioritized profit over the well-being of the land and its people. Others, however, were not so forgiving. They saw Thomas as a troublemaker, someone who had disrupted the flow of progress. To them, the cabins represented jobs, opportunity, and economic growth. They couldn't understand why Thomas would go to such extreme lengths to stop something that could benefit the community. The town was split, and Thomas knew that he would have to navigate this division carefully. Despite the mounting legal troubles and the divided community, Thomas found some solace in the fact that nature had won. The land was healing, slowly but surely. The water had washed away the traces of the construction, leaving behind the land that had existed for centuries. The animals were returning, the birds were singing again, and the plants were beginning to sprout from the rich soil. It was a reminder that, in the end, nature would always prevail. The fight might have been hard, and the consequences might still be uncertain, but at least for now, the land was free. Thomas spent his days walking along the shore, reflecting on everything that had happened. He thought about his great-grandparents and the sacrifices they had made to protect this land. He thought about his future and whether the fight had been worth it. He wasn't sure how the legal battle would turn out. He didn't know if he would lose everything or if he would be able to keep the land that meant so much to him. But one thing was clear, he had done what he felt was right. He had stood up for his family's legacy, for the land, and for future generations who would come after him. In the evenings, when the sun set behind the hills and the sky turned shades of pink and orange, Thomas would sit by the water and watch the world around him. The peace he had fought so hard to protect was returning, and it felt good to know that, for now, the land was safe. He still had a long way to go in his legal battle, but there was something in him that told him he had done the right thing. Sometimes, it wasn't about winning, it was about standing firm in your beliefs and protecting what matters most. The flood had been a dramatic and unexpected solution, but it had worked. The cabins were gone, and the land had been returned to its natural state. It had cost him dearly, but Thomas knew that he couldn't have lived with himself if he hadn't acted. In the end, it wasn't just about the land, it was about the principle of protecting something that was bigger than himself. It was about the legacy of his family and the future of the land they had worked so hard to preserve. As the weeks continued, Thomas kept his head down, focusing on the fight ahead. The legal proceedings were long and drawn out, but he didn't let them consume him. He knew that the battle wasn't over, but for now, he had won the most important part. The land was his again, and it was safe. That was enough for him, at least for now. In the quiet of the evening, as he sat by the water, Thomas reflected on the future. He didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was certain, he had done what he could to protect the legacy of his ancestors, and that was a victory in its own right. The weeks that followed the flood felt like an eternity to Thomas. It was a strange mix of hope and uncertainty, a feeling he couldn't quite put into words. The land was his again, but the cost of regaining it was still settling in. The water had receded, and nature was slowly healing itself. The debris from the construction had been carried away by the current, leaving behind a quieter, more peaceful landscape. Birds were beginning to return, and the familiar rustling of the trees in the wind reminded him of all that had been lost and regained. But the real battle was far from over. The legal ramifications of his actions were starting to become clearer. Thomas had always known that there would be consequences, but now the reality of those consequences was beginning to take shape. Lawyers from the developers and the HOA were working tirelessly to build their case. The media was covering the situation from every angle, some seeing him as a hero and others as a criminal. The divided community seemed to be taking sides, with some supporting him and others condemning his actions. His phone rang constantly, with calls from reporters, lawyers, and even friends asking him how he was holding up. It was a lot to process, but through it all, Thomas stayed calm. One evening, after another long day of meeting with his lawyer and reviewing the flood's aftermath, Thomas sat by the lake again. The sun was setting, casting a golden light over the water. The breeze was cool, and he could hear the soft rustling of the grass as it swayed in the wind. It was moments like this that reminded him why he had done what he did. This land, his family's land, was not just a piece of property. It was a part of his soul. It was the place where his ancestors had fought, laughed, and lived. It was a symbol of their strength, their resilience, and their love for the earth. And for all the trouble he was facing, Thomas knew he had done the right thing. The legal battles continued, with the developers demanding compensation for their lost property and the HOA pushing for harsh penalties. The claims were enormous, but Thomas was not backing down. His lawyer had told him that the fight would be long and costly, but he had made up his mind. If it took everything he had to protect this land, then that was what he would do. He had no intention of giving up, no matter how difficult the road ahead might be. As the legal process dragged on, Thomas began to notice a shift in the way the community viewed him. The people who had once seen him as a troublemaker were starting to see him differently. His actions had sparked a conversation about the importance of preserving natural spaces and standing up against corporate greed. Local environmental groups reached out to offer their support, and even some of the town officials who had initially dismissed his concerns began to listen. The flood had caused widespread damage, yes, but it had also raised awareness about the need to protect the land and the environment. It was clear that the battle for the land was not just Thomas's fight, it was a fight for everyone who believed in preserving what was rightfully theirs. As the months went by, the legal proceedings seemed to slow down. Court dates were pushed back, and the developers grew more desperate. They had underestimated the strength of Thomas's resolve. What they had hoped would be a quick and easy process was now turning into a drawn-out legal struggle. Thomas's lawyer believed they had a solid case, and the support from local environmental groups was only adding weight to their argument. The more the developers fought, the more they began to reveal their true intentions: profits over people, greed over sustainability. And with every court appearance, every meeting, and every piece of evidence that was presented, Thomas grew more confident that he was on the right side of history. The media attention was both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, it kept the pressure on the developers and the HOA, forcing them to explain their actions to the public. On the other hand, it put Thomas under a microscope, making his every move subject to public scrutiny. He had always been a private person, and the attention was overwhelming at times. But even with the cameras following his every move, Thomas kept his focus on the bigger picture. He didn't care about fame or recognition. What mattered to him was that he had stood up for something that mattered, something that would make a difference for generations to come. One day, while walking along the edge of the lake, Thomas was approached by a group of local reporters. They had come to cover the ongoing legal battle, but this time, it felt different. They weren't just looking for a story, they were looking for answers. The question they asked was simple: do you think you've won? Thomas paused for a moment before answering. The question was loaded, and the truth was complicated. He had won, in a way. The land was his again, and the construction had been stopped. Nature had been allowed to reclaim what was rightfully hers. But there was still a long road ahead. The legal fight wasn't over, and the consequences of his actions were still to be fully realized. He couldn't say he had won, not yet. But he was determined to keep fighting. "I don't think anyone can say they've won yet," he said. "But I know this: I'm going to keep fighting for this land. For my family. For the future. And I'm not going to let anyone take it from me. Not now, not ever." The reporters nodded, understanding the weight of his words. It wasn't just about the legal case. It was about something much deeper: about standing up for what was right, about protecting the environment, about preserving a legacy. The battle was far from over, but Thomas was no longer fighting alone. The community was starting to rally behind him. The tide was turning, and Thomas could feel it. As the legal battle continued to unfold, something remarkable began to happen. The once divided community started to unite. People who had once been indifferent to Thomas's cause were now supporting him in ways he never expected. Local businesses were offering their assistance, environmental organizations were organizing protests, and even some of the local politicians were speaking out in his favor. What had started as a personal fight had grown into something much larger. It was a movement, one that transcended the legal case and spoke to a greater truth: the land was not just a commodity. It was a part of who they all were, and it was worth fighting for. Thomas had no illusions about what would happen next. He knew that the developers would continue to fight, that the HOA would try to find ways to undermine his efforts. But he also knew that he had something more powerful than money or influence on his side: the truth. The land belonged to him, to his family, and to future generations who would live on it, work on it, and protect it. And no matter how long the battle took, he would never stop fighting to protect it. In the end, it wasn't about winning a lawsuit or proving a point. It was about something deeper, something more meaningful: the belief that some things are worth protecting, no matter the cost. Thomas had taken a stand for what he believed in, and in doing so, he had sparked a movement that would continue long after the legal proceedings had ended. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about all of them: the people, the land, the future. And that was the victory that mattered most.